Let's talk about silence, not as avoidance, not as suppression, but as the most psychologically strategic form of confrontation. And not just confrontation in the sense of a power struggle, but as a revelation. Silence, properly wielded, is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of something much deeper. It's the environment in which truth emerges. It's the mirror that doesn't blink. When you're dealing with a narcissist, understand something fundamental. Their entire psychological existence is structured around evasion. They construct false selves like scaffolding around a hollow center. They lie to themselves before they lie to you. They provoke in order to avoid. They manipulate because truth terrifies them. Why? Because truth requires vulnerability. And vulnerability to them is synonymous with annihilation. Not discomfort, annihilation. Now, when you are dealing with such a person, your first instinct might be to explain, to defend, to reason. And this makes sense because you're not them. You're wired for resolution, for mutual understanding, for reciprocity. You want to fix it. You want to be seen accurately. You want justice. But here's the rub. Engaging with the narcissist on that level grants them power. Every word you speak in defense of your integrity becomes a new angle for them to distort. Every emotional reaction becomes data, ammo for their game. But silence is different. Silence is no data. Silence is a locked door, a blank screen. It's what their psyche can't process because there's nothing to feed on. It terrifies them, not because it's hostile, but because it's reflective. It forces them to see themselves without distraction. When you go silent, you cease to be their emotional mirror. And that's critical, because narcissists don't have an internal sense of self-worth. They rely entirely on external reflection. They look to you, your praise, your anger, your pain to define their importance. The moment you stop giving them that reflection, they're left alone with themselves, and they don't like what they see. Now, this is not silence as passive aggression. That's still a game. That's still you engaging, just covertly. No, this is the silence of transcendence. The kind of silence that says, I'm no longer playing. It's the silence of someone who has chosen truth over turmoil, clarity over chaos. Let's be clear, this kind of silence takes strength. It's much easier to lash out, to explain yourself, to try to correct the record. But strength doesn't always look like action. Sometimes strength is restraint. Sometimes it's the refusal to dance with dysfunction. And it's not just about disarming the narcissist. It's about reclaiming your sanity. It also has a strange and powerful consequence. Silence makes the narcissist feel judged, not because you're judging them, but because, without the noise of manipulation and distraction, their own behavior starts echoing back at them. They interpret your silence as condemnation and that discomfort. That crack in their psychological armor, that's often the first time they begin to feel the weight of their own behavior. Of course, many of them won't admit it. In fact, they might escalate at first. They'll throw emotional grenades, try to bait you, guilt trip you, accuse you of abandonment or cruelty. But underneath that storm, regret starts to form, not necessarily because they care about you in the way you once hoped they did, but because their illusion of control is dissolving. And that's the only thing they were ever truly invested in. You see, when you go silent, they are no longer in charge of the narrative. And narcissists must control the narrative, because that's how they control reality, yours and theirs. And theirs, your silence rewrites the story without saying a word. And if you remain consistent in that silence, not punishing, not sulking, just done, they're left behind in a play with no audience. And a performer without an audience is nothing. What happens then? The narcissist begins to regret, not always out of empathy, but out of loss of leverage. They regret the slipping of control. They regret the closing of access. They regret the fact that your silence has become louder, more potent, more final than any argument could ever be. And in that regret, they flail. But by then, you're already gone. Not just physically, but psychologically, energetically, existentially. And here's the deeper truth. Your silence isn't about them at all. It's about you. It's about choosing to no longer be defined by someone else's brokenness. It's about cultivating inner peace that doesn't require external validation. It's about remembering that sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is to say nothing at all. Not from fear, not from weakness, but from the realization that the truth no longer needs to be proven. It simply is. It simply is. So when the moment comes and you're tempted to respond, to explain, to remind them of what they did, remember this: they already know. They may never admit it. But your silence has already begun the process of dismantling the illusion they built. Let it, because real power isn't loud. Real power doesn't demand attention. Real power is silent presence. It's clarity, it's wholeness, and nothing threatens a narcissist more than someone who no longer needs them to be whole. Stop feeding what's false. Go quiet. Let the silence speak. Let's talk about something most people underestimate: presence. Not presence in the shallow sense of just being in a room, but the kind of presence that redefines the room. The kind of presence that radiates authority without a single word. You felt it before when someone walks in and the air shifts. That's not charisma. That's not charm. That's alignment. That's psychological gravity. And narcissists, well, they hate it. Why? Because narcissists feed off attention, but not just any attention. They need the kind of attention that validates their delusions, their exaggerated self-importance, their fantasy that they are the center of the universe and everyone else merely satellites in orbit. But when you enter a room with genuine presence, rooted, calm, sovereign, you don't orbit. You anchor. And suddenly their gravitational pull starts to weaken. That terrifies them. You'll have to understand the game that's being played. Narcissists live in a performance. They are constantly managing impressions. It's not that they simply want to be admired, it's that they need it. They need others to play roles in their script: the admirer, the rescuer, the scapegoat, the fool. And if you enter that dynamic unconsciously, you'll be pulled in. You'll find yourself explaining your worth, adjusting your behavior, seeking their approval. And before long, your presence dissolves into their projection. But here's the thing: when you cultivate a strong internal presence, you don't play a role in anyone's fantasy. You become psychologically non-compliant. Not in an aggressive way, but in a deeply unshakable way. You signal, often without words: I don't need you to be okay with me. I don't need you to like me. I'm already grounded. That's not defiance. That's independence. That's psychological sovereignty. And narcissists hate sovereignty because it can't be manipulated. Our presence is built on self-possession. And self-possession doesn't mean perfection. It means you know where you stand. You know what you value. You know how you want to live. You're not living reactively, dancing to someone else's dysfunction. And that kind of clarity, especially when embodied quietly without boasting, disrupts the entire narcissistic ecosystem. Because now, they're not dealing with a pliable mirror. They're dealing with a person. And they can't control a person who's not for sale. Think about how most narcissistic dynamics play out. There's often a lot of noise, drama, highs and lows, push and pull. It's designed that way because confusion breeds dependence. And in chaos, the narcissist always positions themselves as the one with the answers, or the one you need forgiveness from, or the one who gets to decide your value. The presence slices through that noise like a blade. It says, I don't need to perform here. I know who I am. That's incredibly threatening to someone whose entire self-concept relies on dominance and illusion. When you don't flinch in the face of provocation, when you don't chase validation, when you don't collapse into self-doubt just because someone disapproves, that's when your power becomes. Because that kind of presence can't be faked, and it can't be taken away either. Now, people misunderstand what this kind of strength looks like. They think it's loud. They think it's confrontational. But true presence is often the opposite. It's stillness. It's control. It's the refusal to over-explain, to over-apologize, to justify your peace. It's the deep understanding that your energy is sacred. and you don't hand it out like candy to anyone who demands it. This is where the psychological depth matters. Because if you haven't done the internal work, your silence becomes brittle. It's a mask. But when you've faced yourself, when you've confronted your wounds, your patterns, your ego, then your presence becomes forged in something unshakable. And when that kind of presence meets a narcissist, the game is already over. Because you won't play. He'll see the manipulation and choose not to react. And he'll recognize the gaslighting and hold your center. You'll feel the bait being dangled and walk right past it. Not out of spite, not out of arrogance, but because you're not hungry for the bait. You've fed yourself truth. You've nourished yourself with dignity. You don't need their scraps. And that's the thing. Narcissists regret most when they realize they can't touch you anymore, that their tricks don't work, that the guilt they used to dangle like a weapon now falls flat, that the charm that once disarmed you now has no effect. It's not that you became cold, it's that you became clear. Presence is power. It doesn't have to yell. It doesn't have to plead. It just is. And in a world where so many people are performing, trying to prove themselves, trying to be chosen, your quiet, unwavering presence is a revolution. It's a threat to every lie that says you have to earn your worth by dancing for someone else's approval. So cultivate it, guard it. Practice it in silence, build it in solitude. And when the moment comes, when the narcissist tries to draw you back into their illusion, you'll already be free. Because when your presence speaks louder than their performance, the battle is already won. Let's explore something subtle but profoundly powerful. Strategic silence. Not the kind that comes from fear or hesitation, but the kind that emerges from clarity. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of insight, self-possession, and unwavering intent. This is the silence that disarms manipulation, confuses narcissists, and reveals the truth without you needing to say a word. You see, narcissists rely on reaction. Their entire playbook is built around getting a rise out of you, whether it's admiration, defensiveness, guilt, or anger. As long as you're reacting, they're controlling the frame. They're defining the emotional tone of the interaction. They bait you, you bite, and now you're in the dance. But when you don't take the bait, when your response is silence, measured and composed, it disrupts the entire strategy, and they hate that. Why? Because silence, when used correctly, forces reflection. It creates a space where the truth echoes louder than their lies. It makes them confront what they've spent years avoiding, their own emptiness, their own lack of substance. Narcissists are masters of noise. Verbal manipulation, emotional chaos, circular arguments, word salads, guilt trips. They flood your senses so you can't think clearly. They overwhelm you so you question yourself, but silence is the antidote. It clears the fog. It says, I see what you're doing, and I'm not playing. Most people feel compelled to explain themselves, to defend their intentions, to over-communicate. From the false belief that your value must be proved, that your boundaries need to be justified. Strategic silence emerges when that insecurity is replaced with conviction. You don't need to argue with someone who's already committed to misunderstanding you. You don't need to win a debate with someone who isn't operating in good faith. Sometimes the most powerful statement is no statement at all. That's not passivity. That's power. Power restrained is more intimidating than power unleashed because it shows you're not ruled by impulse. You're not at the mercy of external chaos. You're governed by something internal, something steady. And that kind of presence unsettles manipulators. They don't know how to read it. They can't control it. It reflects back to them their own instability. And that's deeply uncomfortable. You've probably heard the phrase, oh, don't feed the troll. Well, narcissists are real-life trolls. Emotionally, psychologically, even spiritually. They poke, they prod, they provoke. And the moment you respond with outrage, you're feeding the beast. But if you respond with dignified silence, they're left flailing. Their script falls apart because the power dynamic they depend on requires your participation. And when you no longer participate, they lose. Now, I'm not saying you should be silent forever. This isn't about avoiding conflict or suppressing your voice. It's about timing. It's about understanding that silence isn't the absence of communication. It is communication. And when delivered with intent, it says, I'm not here to entertain dysfunction. I'm not here to validate delusion. I'm here to protect my peace. Strategic silence is especially potent after you've spoken your truth clearly and once. That's enough. If they twist your words, shift the blame, or demand a reaction, that's the moment to disengage. Not because you're weak, but because you refuse to be dragged into a psychological vortex where nothing real can grow. It's important to note, this kind of silence requires strength. It's not easy to hold your ground while someone throws emotional grenades at you. It's not easy to walk away from manipulation without giving in to the urge to clarify or defend. But strength grows in resistance. And every time you resist the compulsion to react, you grow more sovereign, more calm, more formidable. There's something deeply philosophical here too. Silence connects us to meaning. In a world of noise, constant opinions, and instant reactions, silence is almost sacred. It makes space for the real to emerge. And in conflict, it allows you to see clearly what's actually happening, what patterns are at play, and what you need to do. So, I don't know. So what does this look like in practice? It looks like pausing when someone tries to provoke you. It looks like walking away from a circular argument instead of repeating yourself. It looks like responding to a manipulative message with no reply at all. And in some cases, it means going no contact entirely, because sometimes the ultimate silence is complete disengagement. Not out of hatred, but out of deep self-respect. And here's the most ironic part. Narcissists expect chaos. They thrive in it. When you don't give it to them, when you instead offer stillness, reflection, unshakable composure, they don't just feel discomfort, they feel exposed. They're forced to sit with the emptiness they've been trying to cover with control. And that's when the regret begins. Not always immediately and not always consciously. But at some point, they realize they can't touch you anymore. And that gnaws at them. So when you think about power, real power, don't overlook silence. It's not submission. It's not weakness. It's clarity in motion. And when you master it, you no longer need to prove yourself to people who have no interest in understanding you. Because sometimes the loudest statement you'll ever make is the silence that says you're finally free. Let's talk about something that's easily dismissed in a world obsessed with confrontation, but which holds a kind of power few understand: emotional detachment. Not apathy, not coldness, but conscious, intentional detachment. The kind that says, I see what's happening here, and I choose not to internalize it. Because what narcissists crave above all else is your emotional entanglement. They want your heart on a string and your reactions at their command. When you remove that access, when your emotions no longer revolve around their behavior, it destabilizes the entire psychological game they've been playing. Narcissists feed off emotional energy. It doesn't matter if it's love, rage, confusion, or pain. It's all fuel. In fact, the negative stuff tends to work better for them because it's easier to provoke and easier to spin. They don't want connection. They want control. They don't want intimacy. They want obedience. And one of the most subversive things you can do is to become emotionally unavailable to their manipulation. People often confuse emotional detachment with withdrawal, like you're somehow failing to engage or you're avoiding something. But it's actually a form of radical engagement with reality. You're choosing to see things as they are, not as you wish they were. That clarity comes at a cost, because it usually means letting go of illusions you were heavily invested in. Maybe you wanted to believe the narcissist could change. Maybe you clung to the fantasy that they just needed more love, more understanding, more patience. But emotional detachment begins where fantasy ends. It's what happens when the fog lifts and you start responding to truth rather than projection. Here's the psychological reality. Narcissists only have power over the emotions you allow them to influence. If they insult you and you crumble, it's not the insult that broke you, it's the meaning you assign to it. If they withdraw affection and you chase them, it's not the distance that hurts, it's the story you tell yourself about being unworthy. They don't create your pain. They expose the cracks in your foundation. And the work is to reinforce those cracks so they no longer have access. This is where detachment becomes transformative. When you stop reacting emotionally, you gain a kind of freedom most people don't realize they've lost. You're no longer dancing to someone else's rhythm. You're grounded in yourself. You're operating from internal validation, not external approval. And the narcissist feels it. They notice when their manipulations no longer land. They feel the vacuum where your emotional turmoil used to be. That silence, that calm, that lack of response, that is their worst nightmare. It tells them without words that they no longer matter in the way they used to. And that realization burns. This kind of detachment doesn't happen overnight. It requires deep inner work, emotional discipline, self-inquiry, and a brutal commitment to truth. You have to catch yourself in the act of over-explaining, of chasing closure, of assigning meaning to someone else's chaos. You have to learn to sit with discomfort without trying to fix it by getting a reaction. And you have to become intimately familiar with your own wounds, because if you don't, they'll keep being used against you. It's a paradox. The more emotionally detached you become from the narcissist, the more emotionally connected you become to yourself. You start to notice your own boundaries, your own values. And instead of contorting yourself to fit into someone else's dysfunction, you begin aligning with what's real, what's healthy, what's true. That's power, not the kind that screams, but the kind that knows. Quiet, unshakable, rooted in reality. There's something profoundly philosophical here, too. Detachment is not just a tactic, it's a stance, a worldview. It's the understanding that you are not your emotions, and other people's chaos is not your responsibility. It's the deep psychological realization that inner peace isn't something you find by fixing others. It's something you build by unhooking from dysfunction. This unhooking, this reclaiming of self doesn't just frustrate the narcissist, it exposes the entire fragility of their illusion. Because once you're emotionally untouchable, they can't use fear to control you. They can't use guilt to manipulate you. They can't use charm to seduce you back into the cycle. The puppet strings are cut, and all that's left is them, alone, exposed, and powerless. When you get to this place, you stop needing closure. You stop needing apologies. You stop needing the story to end a certain way. You're no longer a character in their narrative. You're the author of your own. And that shift, that internal restructuring, it changes everything. So if you find yourself in the web of a narcissist, ask yourself, where am I still emotionally hooked? What story am I still trying to rewrite through this person? And what would it feel like to simply stop playing? Because at the end of the day, the most dangerous person to a manipulator is the one who refuses to be manipulated, not by arguing, but quietly stepping out of the game. When you detach emotionally, you don't just silence the narcissist, you awaken the part of yourself that was never theirs to control. One of the most profound and underestimated acts of strength is refusing to explain yourself to someone who has no genuine interest in understanding you. It's such a subtle, quiet form of resistance that people often overlook it. But make no mistake, it's a declaration of sovereignty. It's a refusal to be pulled into a game that was never about truth, only control. Narcissists don't ask questions to understand. They ask to corner, to gaslight, to undermine. Every time they demand an explanation, it's like they're throwing out a net, waiting to see how much of yourself you'll tangle in trying to prove that your reality is legitimate. They want you scrambling for their approval, because if you're explaining, you're defending. And if you're defending, you're not centered. You're not standing in truth. You're caught. And they love that. Here's the psychological trick behind it. The more you explain, the more ground you're giving up. Because in that moment, you're accepting the premise that their perception is the standard by which your existence should be measured. That their approval is the final stamp of your worth. But why should you have to justify your feelings, your boundaries, your decisions to someone who's only ever distorted them to serve their own ends? When you stop explaining yourself, you're not being cold or dismissive. You're stepping out of a rigged debate. You're refusing to participate in a dialogue where one side is always shifting the terms, and that silence, it speaks louder than 1,000 justifications ever could. It says, I know who I am. I know what I saw. I don't need your permission to validate it. This kind of clarity isn't easy to come by, because we're socialized to explain, to smooth things over, to make ourselves palatable. Especially if you're a naturally empathetic person, you probably have a reflex to fix misunderstandings, to bridge gaps, to ease tensions. But when you're dealing with a narcissist, that instinct becomes a weapon they use against you. Every bridge you build, they burn. Every olive branch you extend becomes a whip they turn back on you. And so, over time, you learn. You start to realize that not everyone who questions you is looking for an answer. Some are just looking for leverage. Some are testing to see how much of your truth you're willing to bargain away in order to be seen, to be accepted. But once you grasp this, once you really internalize that not every conflict deserves your energy, you begin to conserve yourself. You stop leaking power into conversations designed to deplete you. You stop justifying your soul to people who wouldn't recognize its value, even if you spelled it out. This shift is spiritual as much as it is psychological, because to not explain is to trust your own perception. It's to trust your inner authority over someone else's performance. And that trust, that unshakable trust in yourself, scares narcissists more than confrontation ever could. See, they know how to handle confrontation. They thrive on it. They know how to twist arguments, how to play the victim, how to bait you into saying something they can use later. But silence, calm, unwavering, sovereign silence, that terrifies them because there's no foothold in it. No emotional thread to pull, just stillness, just boundaries. What's even more powerful is this. When you stop explaining yourself, you give others permission to do the same. You model a kind of self-respect that's rare in a culture obsessed with external validation. You show that it's possible to live from the inside out rather than the outside in. And in doing so, you change the terms of engagement, not just with narcissists, but with everyone. Your silence becomes a litmus test. Those who value you will lean in. They'll respect your boundaries. They won't demand explanations because they trust your discernment. But those who seek control will recoil. They'll call you cold, arrogant, selfish. And that's how you know the silence is working. This isn't about becoming hard or emotionally distant. It's about becoming aligned. Aligned with your values, your instincts, your vision of who you're becoming. It's about not letting someone else's dysfunction become the filter through which you define your own identity. Because every time you explain yourself to someone who's committed to misunderstanding you, you're handing them a piece of your integrity, and eventually you run out. So what do you do instead? You set the boundary. You speak your truth once clearly, and then you let the chips fall. You let your silence speak where words would only be twisted. You choose peace over performance, and you reclaim all the energy that would have gone into defending yourself against someone who's never going to hear you anyway. The real power lies in that pause, that breath, that refusal. Because in that moment, you're not reacting, you're choosing. You're rising above the chaos rather than sinking into it, and that's the essence of freedom. It's not about escaping conflict. It's about transcending the need to be validated in the middle of it. So the next time you're pulled into the gravitational field of someone demanding explanations they don't deserve, Remember this, the most powerful sentence you can ever say is no sentence at all. Silence isn't weakness, it's mastery. What truly terrifies the narcissist isn't confrontation. It isn't being exposed or even being left behind, at least not in the way most people assume. What terrifies them more than anything is your detachment, your emotional neutrality, your refusal to play the game. Because once you're no longer emotionally reactive, you're no longer controllable. And in their world, that's equivalent to death. A narcissist doesn't thrive on your presence. They thrive on your attention. And when you remove that, surgically and silently, you starve the entire system that fuels their illusion of power. See, people like to think that silence is passive, that it's avoidance. A connection will sever the energetic cord that connects you to someone who never really saw you as a person in the first place. And when you step away from that role, when you stop reacting, stop justifying, stop explaining, they're left standing in front of a mirror that no longer reflects anything. And that's when their world begins to crack. But let's go deeper. Let's look at what this really means, psychologically and philosophically. A narcissist is addicted to a false self, a fragile construct built from external validation, manipulation, and the illusion of control. They don't actually have a solid identity. They borrow it from others. They cobble it together from admiration, fear, and compliance. So when you detach, when you no longer give them the drama or the praise or the submission, they're left alone with the one thing they've been running from their entire life, themselves. And make no mistake, that is the core of their suffering. That is the dragon they cannot slay. You, on the other hand, when you go silent, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in clarity, what you're doing is asserting your autonomy in the most potent way possible. You're saying, I am no longer participating in the distortion of reality that props you up, and that is an existential threat to them. Why? Because you are no longer functioning as part of their illusion. And illusions cannot survive without believers. Now here's where the deeper insight comes in. Your silence isn't just about escaping their chaos. It's about reclaiming your inner order. It's about building a life where you're no longer defined by someone else's dysfunction. That takes strength, real strength. The kind of strength that doesn't need to shout, simply is, like a mountain, like a still lake, quiet but immovable. And this silence, this stillness, this withdrawal of energy, it becomes a miracle. Not the kind they can manipulate, but the kind that reflects reality back at them with brutal clarity. They start to see the cracks in their own mask. They feel the absence of your emotional fuel, and suddenly their behavior isn't having the same effect. The levers they used to pull no longer trigger anything, and that scares them. Because now they're exposed. Not to the world, but to themselves. It's in this space that transformation begins, not for them necessarily, but for you, because your silence isn't about punishing them. It's about healing you. It's about no longer outsourcing your peace to someone else's approval or attention. Begin to build boundaries not as walls of defense, but as structures of integrity. You speak less, but you say more. You move less, but with greater precision. And the people who are aligned with your peace, your clarity, your depth, they'll find you. And those who needed chaos to feel alive, they'll fade away, or rage, or both. But either way, you'll be free. There's something profoundly sacred about reaching a point in your journey where your peace is non-negotiable, where you realize that just because someone demands a reaction doesn't mean they deserve one. That just because someone tries to provoke you doesn't mean you have to rise to the bait. That just because someone once held power over your emotions doesn't mean they always will. So, the next time you're tempted to re-engage, to explain, to prove your worth, pause. Breathe. Remember that the most effective response is often no response at all. That clarity doesn't always need a voice to be heard. That sometimes the deepest form of communication is silence. Because here's the truth. When your silence is rooted in self-respect, it echoes louder than any words you could speak. And when your detachment is born of clarity rather than fear, it becomes a kind of light, an unshakable presence, one that no narcissist can stand in for very long. So let them wonder. Let them spin, each a void of their own making. You don't owe chaos a reply. You owe yourself peace. And sometimes the strongest statement you can make is simply to walk away and say absolutely nothing at all.